Thank you, Chris. I'd like to, of course, welcome and acknowledge the presence of Mr. Kanzaki from JICA, Changyong Rhee from IMF, Mr. Xianbin from ADB, for their presence here today. I do not intend to make a very long speech, but essentially to introduce some of the matters that we've been discussing today and the importance of building resilience to natural disasters and climate change. But I'd like to firstly acknowledge the resources and the input by IMF, ADB, and also JICA for the team effort, for the presence here. The level of representation from IMF, from JICA, and also ADB shows their level of commitment to address this very salient issue and very pertinent issue that is applicable and indeed very dear to Pacific Island countries. Pacific Island countries, as you would know, ladies and gentlemen, is very much at the cold face of climate change, and as a result of which you have the natural disasters that ensues from the result of climate change. The task, of course, facing us is how do we build our resilience to natural disasters? Now, of course, within the context of climate change, natural disasters are gaining frequency, in particular in terms of things like hurricanes and cyclones. It's gaining frequency. It's also increasing in intensity. And also on the same page, we have Pacific Island countries that are, of course, vulnerable to these natural disasters. But also the level of vulnerability becomes a lot more enhanced given the size of our economies. Given the lack of economies that also exist, economies of scale that exist within the Pacific Island countries. So we have a challenge, and it is very important for us, in order to be able to address these challenges, to help development partners such as IMF, ADB, JICA, and various other partners such as World Bank, to work together with us to be able to find solutions to these problems. These are not necessarily easy challenges, but they also require a lot of input, a lot of resources. And so we've had discussions today in respect of how do we, for example, reduce our risk from natural disasters, how do we build resilient economies, and of course to be able to manage public finances through a methodology in which we have debt sustainability. Because as we've demonstrated through, as was seen, I should say, through Cyclone Winston, the depth of the damage that one climatic event can cause can be quite devastating. It caused a loss of about a third of our value of our GDP, which is very, very significant. And so many other Pacific Island countries face these issues. So the sessions that were held this morning, and also a couple of sessions that will be held this afternoon, actually does discuss these matters. From our perspective, we believe, of course, that Pacific Island countries, including other countries in other parts of the world, does not only require partnership with their development partners, but also a particular level of accessibility to finance. And that finance needs to be, of course, or the accessibility to that finance needs to be measured through what we call a vulnerability or fragility index. We have stated in the past few days, in particular with the gathering we've had at the Forum Secretariat of the economic ministers from the other Pacific Island countries, that our development partners and we all need to get together to develop some form of objective assessment or objective indexation about levels of fragility and vulnerability. This does not necessarily mean that more countries will be included in the scope of vulnerable nations, but the indexation must also take into account that some countries may not always fall in the vulnerable category, but may fall into it after a particular climatic event. And so these are some of the very pertinent issues that we need to discuss, we need to eke out. And also we in Fiji believe that we need to also partner with the private sector. And we've seen discussions around that and how some other countries have done it successfully. And we again need the interlocutors such as ADB and the IMF and various other partners, including JICA, as to how we can have this partnership with the private sector. And a collaboration between government, the private sector, the MDBs will help us to be able to achieve those objectives in a lot more defined and a lot more transparent and efficient manner. So with those few introductory remarks, I'd like to once again thank everybody here who seated here for the input. and for their dedication and willingness to put this on the agenda. It's something that's very important that affects other Pacific Island countries. Naka.